Well, after 2 months of hemming and hawing and big promises and pledges, the House Republicans are finally showing their true colors. The Republicans were given a $2 billion budget surplus on a silver platter, and now they want to give it all back to corporate special interests with a silver spoon. They're wasting our opportunity to expand economic opportunity for all Minnesotans in order to cater to the priorities of their corporate backers. They want to give tax cuts to corporate special interests that don't need it. If you just look at House File 1, which was their #1 priority bill, you can see where they're headed, even though they don't want to tell you. And I'm not surprised they don't want to tell you right now what their plans are, because really what it is about catering to their corporate special interest friends. And they've also promised everything to everybody, which they clearly can't deliver now. And so their only course is to balance the books, is to return to the same old shifts and gimmicks that got us into trouble in 2011. We've been down this path before, and here we go again. With a $2 billion surplus, first of all, we can do better for Minnesota kids, especially our students at both ends of the spectrum. Those preschool kids who need a head start and college students who are seeking an affordable degree. We should be able, with $2 billion surplus, to reduce student debt, to freeze tuition, and to invest in our earliest learners. Instead, the Republicans are prioritizing cutting taxes, again, for the corporate special interest friends. The biggest losers in this budget are our kids. Less than 1% increase for education in a budget with a $2 billion surplus, and $775 million less than Governor Dayton has proposed to invest in kids and in our college students. That's the wrong priorities. With a $2 billion surplus, it's also outrageous that the Republicans would cut funding for Minnesota seniors and disabled and the most vulnerable. 2 years ago, we had a $625 million deficit, and the House Democrats did propose a $150 million cut to the Health and Human Services budget. And the Republicans, if you recall, were apoplectic. Kurt Doudt was outraged that we would consider that there was no excuse for doing that. And yet now with a $2 billion surplus, Republicans want to cut our most vulnerable by over $1 billion. Cutting taxes for millionaires and the wealthy by cutting services for our most vulnerable should offend the sensibilities of every Minnesotan, and it will, because it's the wrong priorities, and frankly, it's simply mean-spirited. Throwing vulnerable Minnesotans under the bus in order to serve and give tax breaks to corporate special interests is just the wrong direction for our state. And finally, with a $2 billion surplus, we shouldn't need shifts and gimmicks and funny money to balance our budget. But it appears that's where we're headed as well. You heard the speaker today calling the budgeting methodologies that we've used for decades in Minnesota fictitious. We've been down this path before. The only way they can give the whole surplus back to serve their party interests, to serve Keith Downey, and to serve corporate special interests, is again to do the shifts and gimmicks and jeopardize the state's fiscal future. And what we saw and what we know about that is that in 2011, that was the recipe for shutdown. The budget targets that the Republicans are putting out today is a recipe for heading the state to a shutdown in a time of a $2 billion budget surplus. That's wrong. And that's why this give the deficit back budget is the wrong direction for Minnesota. They're raiding general fund dollars for transportation, and it's interesting in this budget, they're not accounting for the transportation bill that they announced yesterday. If you look at the numbers that they have, they've invested and borrowed and taken out of the general fund at least $600 million in that transportation budget for this biennium that is not accounted for anywhere in the spreadsheets that you've been given today. So already we're seeing kind of this shell game of budgeting that the Republicans have become known for. And again, it's a recipe for not getting anything done and for shutting our government down. Now, I'd like to just spend a few minutes going through the real numbers here, because I don't think the Republicans really shared that with you. They shared a political document. But the spreadsheets we've handed out, if you look at the very last column on that spreadsheet, which is the House targets, and this is from nonpartisan research, compared to the 16-17 forecast, which is how we do our budgeting and how the spreadsheets will end up. And you'll see here, $156 million more for education, $53 million more for higher ed. Again, that's $775 million less than the governor has proposed. It's a 1% increase. And as Representative Knobloch said, it won't even allow them to do the tuition freeze that they've been promising over and over again, let alone deal with student debt and other issues. And it certainly won't allow them to put any money into the K-12 system if they're going to do anything for early childhood. You'll also see here $1.15 nearly billion cut to Health and Human Services, a 7% cut to that Health and Human Services budget, which again largely goes to people in nursing homes, people seeking long-term care, and the disabled, the very people the Republicans said were going to be their #1 priority. They can't do that with a $1.15 billion budget cut. $24 million cut to in the environment. And here's another one that I think is significant. If you look at the jobs budget, cutting $20 million, so spending less money on creating jobs in Minnesota, on economic development for greater Minnesota. You know, what's in that budget? Things like investment in broadband, things like investment in workforce housing, things like greater Minnesota economic development. The things, again, the Republicans said were going to be their top priorities, and yet they're cutting that budget by over $20 million. If we look at the real numbers, you'll see that the Republican budget numbers, the Republican budget math simply doesn't add up. And I think Minnesotans should be very concerned about that. I mean, you know, it's easy for us in the Capitol to get lost in these numbers, but what that means is real cuts to people in this state in a time of huge budget surpluses, again, only because they feel the need to give corporate tax cuts to their backers. And it means that we are headed in the next 2 months to a situation where we're going to be disagreeing about what the numbers actually mean. We're going to be talking about budgets that look very different from each other. I mean, the governor's budget, I will see what the Senate comes out with compared to the Republican budget. It's a recipe for shutdown. Minnesotans should be very concerned about this, and the fact that the Republicans continue to be unwilling to actually look at the true numbers, the true cost of what it means to provide services in Minnesota, the true way to budget in this state. And it's disappointing, and it's a little bit scary, quite frankly. We really need to embrace the opportunity that has been given us with this recovering economy and the $2 billion budget deficit, and yet the Republicans are clearly on a path to squander that opportunity, And I just have to make one other comment. For the Republicans to come out today and compare their commitment to family budgets after spending 5 hours on the floor last night, essentially slashing the budgets of tens and tens of thousands of Minnesotans by cutting the minimum wage for some of the hardest workers in the state, I find incredibly distasteful, and just shows their true colors and the value that they have on political rhetoric over the reality of Minnesotans' lives. I don't know if you guys want to say anything else. Go ahead.
Well, I think this is all about priorities. Remember 2 years ago, we had, as which Minority Leader Thissen just mentioned, over $600 million deficit. We owed our schools back $800 million, and yet we made it the education session. And last 2 years, we put in over $600 million of huge, important investments into education, including all-day, everyday kindergarten, and over $250 million of investments into higher education so we could freeze tuition. That's over $800 million in times of a deficit, and we still had IOUs back to schools. This year, with almost a $2 billion surplus given to the Republicans by a growing economy, hardworking Minnesotans, and good governance, they are spending an increase of under 1% for education. If you $150 million for E through 12, $53 million for higher education. Over $800 million to $200 million. Those are the priorities, very clear, between are you going to put students and kids and our future first, or are you going to put tax breaks to corporate special interests first? And that is a huge, huge priority difference. And one more point is, you know, you look at the $1.1 billion cut to Health and Human Services, and I know Representative Dean has talked about eliminating Minnesota Care. Minnesota Care helps disproportionately rural Minnesota families. The top 25 counties per capita with people on MinCare is rural Minnesota. And what's really funny is that when we're in a time of deficits, the Republicans' plan for working families is to cut services. And now when we're in a surplus, their plan is to cut services to working families. No wonder working families can never get ahead under Republican majority, because they're up against special interest and tax breaks for others before their benefits. And so the priorities are very, very clear. You have priorities of the governor and the Democrats is for the future, and then you have the Republicans, which is to make sure you reward your special friends.
Representative Thissen, I think 3 times you called this a recipe for a shutdown. This is an opening bid. Why can't you guys work together toward bridging what is seemingly a divide?
I hope we can, but I'm just saying in 2011, we went to shutdown, and the reason we went to shutdown is because the Republicans didn't believe the numbers, the Republicans made up numbers, and the Republicans prioritized special interests over, working people. And that's what they're doing right here again.
Representative, the Republicans were comparing their numbers to actual spending last biennium. You're comparing their budget to expected or proposed spending for the current biennium. Why do you think your comparison is a fairer one than comparing it to the actual spending the last 2 years?
Because that's how we have always done budgets. And secondly, it's because it actually builds in the reality that there's growth in the economy. So the growth in the budgets is not just because we're spending more per person. We actually have more people in Minnesota. We actually have a growing economy. That's all good stuff, but it also means that the cost of providing those services go up. So these are and this is how a family would budget. A family doesn't budget themselves by saying costs are not going to go up. They budget and anticipate that there's actually going to be increases in the cost of living. I mean, that's the reality of life. The Republicans like to ignore that reality, but that is the reality of life.
Those of you who are conversant about the Human Services budget, I'd like you to know your assessment of the claim that we can save a lot of money in the state by cracking down on eligibility in medical assistance.
We can't even come close. We can't even come close to $1 billion in cracking down on eligibility of medical assistance. Do we need to always continue to look at that and make sure that that's correct? Absolutely. But we're never going to come to make $1 billion in cuts to health and human services without hurting people. I mean, they may claim this is growth in the budget, and this is the other response to the earlier question, but to the person that, the diabetic that was getting diabetic strips, to the person with mental health needs that was getting services and now won't get those services, those are real cuts in their lives. And so there's absolutely this fiction that we can find fraud and waste our way out of $1 billion in that budget, 7% of the entire budget. I don't think that that's close to accurate. And the other thing that I would note, kind of on the health and human services side, is that the proposal to eliminate Minnesota Care and move that into MNsure, that's not even general fund money. So that doesn't even show up in this budget spreadsheet. That's healthcare access fund money. So you can't. So that what we're really talking about right now is a $1.5 billion cut if they're going to follow through on that plan.
I think when we saw this behavior in 2011, what we saw was fictitious numbers and holes in their budget, right? The Republicans, when they had to make big cuts because there was a deficit, were unable to really produce those cuts in health and human services, not in a way that was meaningful. They just had fictitious numbers in their budget because even they don't really want to make the cuts that they had to make then to solve a deficit. Now we have a surplus and they're choosing to make cuts, significant cuts in health and human services. And I think when I go to the committee this afternoon, we're going to be dispensing Tums because there will be so many people that didn't really believe this was going to happen. Over and over again, as I warned them we were going to see a cut to this budget target, they said we have such a significant surplus. Why would we see cuts to people with disabilities? Why would we see cuts to people who get their health care through Minnesota Care? Why would we see cuts to people who are relying on services to live their lives independently all over the state of Minnesota? And they will see today that even in a time of surplus, the priority for the Republicans is not to assure independence and health, but instead to give corporate givebacks to their supporters. And we'll take that next step beginning this afternoon.
You all have talked about corporate givebacks. What specifically are you talking about?
Well, the first one is House File 1, which is their premier bill, which is several $100 million of special interest tax cuts to corporations and businesses.
And what are the shifts and gimmicks? Could you be more specific about?
Well, I think we have to watch out for it. I know that in the transportation budget, they're shifting lots of money around. There's not a lot of new money in that budget. And again, none of that new money that I can tell is actually accounted for in their spreadsheet. So, they're going to be spending more out of the general fund on transportation that actually shows up on their spreadsheet. And then, I get concerned that they're going to do a shift on the Health and Human Services budget to use the Healthcare Access Fund instead of for what it's used for other purposes, just to dump that into the general fund to help fund, their tax cuts. So those would be two examples. And we know from, previously Representative Murphy talked about this, I think it was $750 million that they made up in the last Health and Human Services budget in this federal waiver, several $100 million at least. They had the tax, the money there, a lot more money, $130 million they're going to collect in additional taxes by auditing people that actually ended up, maybe getting a couple $2 million. So they have a history of doing this, and I think it's just very important that people stay on top of that and watch for these shifts and gimmicks, which we will be doing. All right, thank you.